que quem vai entrar agora não é pouca coisa não. É o príncipe do Brasil. E já que nós não temos a nossa Fox News aqui no Brasil, a gente importou alguém da Fox News para cá. Olha o prestígio que a gente está, né? Eu gostaria de convidar para vir aqui ao lado, na lateral do palco, o senhor Walid Phares, escritor, comentarista da Fox News. O cara que sabe tudo de Oriente Médio, Irã, Síria, Estado Islâmico, por favor, velho. E o dono disso tudo daqui, até onde os seus olhos tocarem, príncipe Luís Felipe de Orleans e Bragança. É trineto da princesa Isabel, tá certo? E nessa dinâmica aqui, eles vão falar um pouquinho sobre a crise na Venezuela e também as atualidades do Oriente Médio, aí incluso certamente a questão do Irã. Então, tem um bom bate-papo. Walid Phares, seja bem-vindo, primeiro americano, depois ainda vai ter a Casey, tem o pessoal dos Estados Unidos que vai falar. O palco é de vocês.
Speak Portuguese?
Two words.
Two words in Portuguese.
Falar português.
Você fala muito bem. Já está muito bem, já está aceito, já é brasileiro. Vamos nacionalizá-lo. We're gonna make you a Brazilian.
I'd love to.
Muito bom dia a todos. Muito obrigado, Eduardo Bolsonaro. Perdão? Inglês? Tá bom. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Eduardo Bolsonaro, for putting this event together. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Thank you for having us and having this discussion about foreign affairs, strategy, about what's going on in other countries and how that may affect our nation and the decisions that we take internally. I would like to start this conversation understanding that Brazil is a medium power considering world affairs. We play a very important role of validating politically the games that are played with the larger nations and the dynamics of the conflicts that originate from this dynamic of superpowers like the United States, maybe Central Europe, Russia, China. And however, we are a regional power. And we do have some constraints here. So I think it would be best for me to ask you a few questions considering the Middle East, because I believe that that's your specialty. In the Middle East, we have a certain war or Cold War taking place at this point. You have, in my interpretation, three main powers in the Middle East. You have Israel, which is a legitimate nation state. You have Saudi Arabia, which have a different form of a legitimacy, which is a absolute theocratic monarchy. And you have also somewhat legitimate, at least from a local point of view, a theocratic republic, which is Iran. So we're talking about only three countries, of which two, which is Saudi Arabia and Iran, are in Cold War with each other for a long time. Both of these nations are rich nations. They're one of the top 20 countries in the world. They do have a middle class. They do have affluency and wealth being generated within their countries, each one in its own way. And all the states that are in proximity are either totally dominated or failed states with civil war, like Iraq, Yemen, and in Africa you have Libya, you have Syria, which are all failed states. And the question here is that Brazil has commercial relationships with all of these countries. Yet, in assuming a political position of making sure that our region gets rid of countries that are totalitarian regimes, and we position ourselves as a leading democratic role model for the region, we are automatically communicating to the world that we would like to have better partnerships with countries that are similar or have the similar values. And when we extrapolate that to the Middle East, it becomes very confusing. Because on the one side, we have an absolute monarchy. On the other side, you have an absolute theocratic regime of Iran. Everything else is a failed state. So what should be Brazil's role and position, considering this very complicated scenario that has a very long tail as far as the way it's now presenting itself to the world? It's we will not solve this issue ourselves, but we have to play the game inevitably. And then on the second question is, what do you think Brazil's role would be, considering our neighboring failed state, which is Venezuela? Venezuela is similar to Syria, is similar to Iraq. It is probably going to fail and collapse into a ruling regime that does not maintain borders of Venezuela, does not maintain security for its own population. So migration will be an issue for Brazil, for Bolivia, for Colombia, all the other states. So what should be our foreign policy regarding a potential social impact of an incredible migration flow, whether we should be more proactive or assume the position that currently is being assumed, that we just need to absorb the migration pattern that from 30 million people, we'll be absorbing a few million in the next few years. That will cost a lot to the Brazilian taxpayer, if that is what we need to do. So I would like to ask you these two questions. They're very easy and simple questions. I'm assuming it's going to take you less than a minute to answer each one of them. Thank you very much.
Is this working? Well, thank you very much. First of all, for being here as a panel with me. I would like, before I answer, to thank Eduardo Bolsonaro for inviting me. I would like to thank CPAC leadership in Brazil, the Schlaps, who are great organizers, great voices in Washington, D.C. and now around the world. I am very happy to be here in Sao Paulo, in Brazil. My last visit was many years ago, and I can guarantee you that for an observer, Brazil has changed tremendously. But the real change that we see out of Washington and out of the United States is really a change in terms of vision. Today, as I heard and saw all these speakers before me, it consolidated the idea that what has happened since last October with the election of your president, Jair Bolsonaro, is a big revolution in soul, in spirit, in intellect, but I think also it is going to impact other countries, first in the neighborhood, and of course, as far as the world is concerned, wherever you have societies that are evolving, that are changing, Brazil will be a model. So thank you for being here, and I would like now to discuss the 2 points that you raised. I would need more than 2 minutes for that, but these are certainly the most important questions in foreign policy that one could raise in Brazil at the time where Brazil is evolving and is moving towards a new future which is going to be bright, there is no doubt about it. When your campaign, let me begin from my own vision so I could answer. When the Bolsonaro campaign started nobody in Washington even noticed in the beginning. We're talking about the summer of last year. So I started to look at the videos, at the speeches, at the Twitter. Many among you know that I'm on Twitter and I'm very active on Twitter. And I realized that this debate is new. And this debate is very comparable to some of the countries you had mentioned in the Middle East. Meaning, should the country stay in the old status quo, which obviously a majority of Brazilians didn't want to remain in, or should it move? That's how in the first weeks of September and October, I started to tweet to draw the attention of the American public. Should it be by being on Fox News or by being on Twitter or Facebook, that something new is happening in Brazil. A new voice has begun in Brazil. And I did not just hear and listen to what the presidential candidate was saying, but what his supporters, yourselves, were tweeting to each other. And I understood that there will be a change in domestic politics, there will be a change in social politics, and, of course, in foreign affairs. And that's why this panel is very, very important. Election took place, and President Bolsonaro started to develop those speeches. He did a visit to Washington, and he delivered a speech that is important, and also at the United Nations, as we all saw. So let me begin by saying foreign policy of this great country is changing. It will impact its neighborhood, and it will impact countries far across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Brazil's side is almost half of Europe. This is 205 million people. The United States and Brazil are the majority in this Western Hemisphere. So all these data are important, but what is more important are the ideas that your president, your government, your excellent foreign ministers speak in many languages, including French, around the world have been developing. Let me go now to the Middle East. Middle East is too long to explain very quickly, but as my good colleague has mentioned, you have poles of influence. Let me begin with the most active pole, not always in a positive way. That's Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since the revolution in 1979, what we have seen in Iran is not just a development of an ideological, theocratical regime, but it has a vision that is not just for Iran. That's where you start seeing the difference. So in 1933, 34, 36 in Germany, you had the rise of National Socialism, but it was not just destined for Germany. The world later on realized that it was destined for all of Europe, and the drama that unfolded basically was World War II. Iran was able over the decades, first to control Iraq. It has militias in Iraq. Then to link up with Syria. Then it has an ally in Lebanon, which is called Hezbollah, that now controls Lebanon. And it has an ally in Yemen, in the south of Arabia, the Houthis. Without going into the details of the Middle East, Iran now is not just Iran. It's the head of a very powerful geopolitical entity which stretches over 4 countries. But beyond that, the Iranian regime, if we can call him regime, has smashed the opposition. There is no opposition really in Iran, organized public one, has also funded and supported cells and networks around the world, and specifically in Latin America. Iran is very influential to the north of you in Venezuela, to the south of you in the tri-border area, and with many other countries around you. So Brazil technically has those virtual ideological borders with the Islamic Republic of Iran because their influence are all around the country. And I may say, and I may add, in past years, Iran had some sort of influence even here in Brazil. So that's one. On the other hand, you have the Arab coalition. The Arab coalition started basically when Iran started to expand, when ISIS, the Islamic State known as Daesh, took land in Syria and Iraq. So you have a coalition of countries headed by Saudi Arabia, but it has the Emirates, it has Egypt, Jordan, other countries. And the coalition basically guess where and what time it moved to become an internationally led coalition. When President Trump in 2017 traveled to Riyadh and called on the heads of 51 or 52 Arab and Muslim states and told them, now is the time to fight terrorism. You should assume this responsibility. We as United States have helped for many, many years, have been active, have lost blood and treasure. But now it's your responsibility. And he addressed them and he asked them to drive the terrorists out. So what we have now, it's true that Saudi Arabia is a theological regime, but after the call by President Trump on all these countries to create their own NATO in the region and to assume their responsibility, something has changed. Besides, inside Saudi Arabia, for many years, and in my books I have written about it, the Wahhabi style, the Salafi style, these extremist, Islamist, jihadi ideologies were very active. But something has happened over the past 3 to 4 years. There is a new reform happening now in Saudi Arabia. They call them the Bin Salman reform, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman reform, heeding the call of his own new society. And guess through where these calls came from? Through Facebook, through Twitter, through the voice of women, through the voice of youth. So it is joining somewhat what has been happening around the world, which is the rise of new civil societies that want to push back against totalitarianism, each one with their own speed. We cannot claim that Saudi Arabia is where Sweden is, say America is, or Brazil is now in terms of civil society and democracy. But remember, those among you who can remember, that women were not able to drive till 6 months ago. In Saudi Arabia, they're driving. Women who were not able to fly and leave the country without an authorization from their husbands or the male custodian, they can. So things are changing, and this should give us a lot of positive aspirations. On top of it, President Bolsonaro and his delegation are going to be visiting Saudi Arabia, are going to be visiting the UAE. So these countries that we call have some comparative similarities are going to exchange experiences. Of course on the economic level, of course on the technological level. But I believe that the phenomenon that you have created here in Brazil, the Bolsonaro ideas and platform, and what is happening in the Middle East is going to interact, is going to create something new in terms of international affairs. Israel is still Israel. It is an ally of the United States. It's a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. It has been threatened by all these radical forces for decades. It's not just for years. Israel now probably has more hope to be integrated in the region. Why? Because the Arab coalition, led now by Saudis and UAE and Egypt and Jordan, realized that after all these decades of war with Israel, the threat to their governments was not coming from Israel. The threat to their governments and people is coming from the other side, from the Iranian regime, from the radicals, from the jihadists, from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda. So what may happen as a result of this realignment of countries and forces, and I expected, and I'm good at projecting, I projected the Arab Spring some 8 years ago. I wrote a book before the so-called Arab Spring titled The Coming Revolution. But I wrote it before the Arab Spring. And people were, making fun of me in Washington. What are you talking about? Well, it did happen. And I was able to detect, not because I'm a prophet, but because I read social media. I read what the youth, what minorities, what people are discussing, and I realized that at one point a change is going to come. The change came. And the change is not always beautiful. Sometimes it's ugly. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes there is a step backward. But the change cannot be stopped. So the 3 poles in the Middle East now, I think that the Iranians have reached the apex, the maximum that they can do. Iran is now witnessing a rise from the inside. Women are rising. Youth are rising. Minorities are rising. Countries where their militias are in control are rising. Yes, indeed, it may take time, but I'm a firm believer that if reforms will take hold in Saudi Arabia, not just reforms, but a revolution will happen inside Iran one day, because society around the world is changing. You cannot stop this. This is what is going to allow youth everywhere around the world to change. I mean, without iPhones, and let me add Samsung, you too. Without those, even Eastern Europe, if you recall, for those who are not so young, that there was a revolt against the Soviet totalitarian regime. Your president here, which was attacked, by the way, during the campaign, as a dictator, as fascist, what he was and he is not so different in leading a movement of change that Poland seen under Václav, under Lech Walesa, that the Czech Republic has seen under Václav Havel. So change will happen, technology will help. Now, the Middle East still has, let me say a couple seconds about what we see in terms of challenges, and then I'll move to Latin America. The Middle East still has some drama happening. And the chief drama that is happening right now is the fate of minorities. Minorities in Iraq, in Syria, in other countries, mostly Christian minorities, Yazidi minorities, ethnic minorities like the Kurds, for example, what's happening now in Syria and Turkey. They have been under threat. And it's really the responsibility of the international community to help these minorities be protected. I mean, you have Christians in Iraq and in Lebanon and in Syria who have been migrating and leaving the countries. Christians were about 18 million. Now they're barely 5 million across the Middle East, and in Egypt as well. So this is a drama that the international community needs to be addressing, and a new foreign policy, not just in Europe, not just in the United States, but in Latin America and Brazil. And you know, Brazilians, that many of you are from descent from the Middle East. Many are Syro-Lebanese, many are Iraqis. So in your new foreign policy, when Brazil recapture its role, not just by being isolated by itself or led by the radicals and the neo-communists, if I may say, then Brazil will be very helpful at the United Nations and elsewhere. Crossing the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, into these beautiful shores. I agree with you that Brazil was in one spot and now it is in another spot. The first challenge that you have, which we still have in America, with the election of Donald Trump, our foreign policy changed. But the resistance against this foreign policy continues. I just was on a couple of interviews this week, and they were asking me, why doesn't the Trump administration do this? Why don't you push more? I know that you have changed, but because we are a democracy and you are a democracy, and in a democracy that is in opposition, and there are mechanisms that would stop you from fulfilling everything you really want. Not for too long. So as for America, which is trying to do its best, first of all in alliance with this new Brazil, but also in the Middle East and in Africa, it's going to take some time before the Trump administration be free to be able to do all what they have promised, all what they're going to promise again for the next mandate. I hope that he will be re-elected. Brazil basically is facing radical forces around it. I'm not here as a foreigner to be involved in domestic Brazilian policies and politics. That's up to you. But as an international observer, it's very clear that out of Latin America and out of this area, there have been radical regimes intervening in other countries. What do you think Cuban forces were doing in Angola? What do you think Cuban forces are doing in Venezuela? As a matter of fact, what do you think Hezbollah from Lebanon is doing in Venezuela? So yes, foreign policy is not a one-way street. It's an interaction. Brazil will have to assume its responsibility with regard to the region, with regard to Latin America in general, with regard to the entire Western Hemisphere, with a close partnership with the United States and with your own partners here in Latin America. The most important goal I see for the new Brazil and the new hemisphere is to fight head-on terrorism. Terrorism has no mercy. We should have no mercy with terrorism. So Brazil is a very important new ally to the United States and the international community to go after the terrorist activities. Second, Brazil's new government has a new narrative. We heard all these brilliant speakers who spoke about freedom, democracy, religious freedom, making sure that we are heard, making sure that we are not suppressed and oppressed by any elite, by any regime that would control our social media. It's the same fight, le même combat, that Brazil has and the United States has. So we see you from the United States as a hope for America. And this America that is now engaged in the same fight is a hope for you. We're going to make sure that Latin America is free from terrorism. We're going to make sure that combating extremism is going to be on the agenda. Now let me zoom it towards the end of my 2 minutes to Venezuela. I don't think you need me to understand Venezuela. It's your neighbor. Your relationship from government to government, military to military, people to people has been there since the beginning of this region. But here's the problem. The United States committed that is going to be helping the Venezuelan people. There is no doubt about that. And the United States sees a change of government and the rise of new leadership under President Jair Bolsonaro a hope to help us and to help other countries in Latin America to do everything we can so that the Venezuelan people restores its liberty. Remember, Venezuela was not totalitarian since it was founded. You and us will remember that Venezuela was a democracy. Venezuela actually had among the oldest political parties in Latin America. From where it was a few decades ago to where it is right now, it's a miserable situation. Unfortunately, Venezuela has dragged and drew all the bad actors in the region and in the world. We have Cuban forces in Venezuela. We have all the networks of radicals in this neighborhood in Latin America in Venezuela. We have Iran. We have Hezbollah. Russia somewhat is not very helpful with regard to Venezuela. So it's not going to be an easy thing to do. But what we see also in Venezuela that we haven't seen before is that the people is rising. The people is not going backward. I have been, as I've done for Brazil, I have done for Venezuela in Washington, showing the public in America that there is a determination by the Venezuelan people to change that situation. I mean, after Eastern Europe, Venezuela, before Venezuela, Brazil, all these societies are moving towards libertad, towards freedom. So my view is that, in conclusion, just by changing itself, Brazil is inspiring many around it, is inspiring many people around the world. And I'm a firm believer that one way or another, that change will get to Venezuela and you'll have another free, democratic, peaceful neighbor to your north. Thank you.
I think we have some time for another set of questions here. It is very interesting that you pointed out that Brazil has a regional leadership role and that it will have an influence on the countries around it and other countries beyond the regional sphere of being connected territorially. Yet, that can be misconstrued to imply that Brazil has to integrate politically with other countries, that the region has to be controlled or has to be politically the same with a supranational power, be it Mercosur or be it directly from the UN. And that type of narrative has been pervasive, even in our military. Our military, they actually believe that Brazil, many of them, believe that Brazilian borders cannot be protected. There are 16, 17,000 kilometers of Brazilian border, and those cannot be protected. It's very wide and it costs too much money to do that. At the same time, the proposal or the narrative that we need a strong foreign policy that determines clear immigration patterns has to be put in place to protect borders from narco-trafficking, terrorism, and also widespread migration, economic migration that violates the citizenship of those that pay taxes and pay for the whole structure to be viable. I will give you an example. Considering that we still do not have a very clear foreign policy in the north, there has been a widespread migration from the Venezuelan border, and all of our indices of health and security have gone down the drain. I've heard reports that we are now Africa level of AIDS contamination in the state in the north. That has not been publicized yet. I overheard it in the government, and that is a real concern because we have the idea that we have to integrate as a region. So we need to develop a new narrative as far as maintaining the national sovereignty, maintaining the value of our citizenship, however, still be able to influence positively on these countries that are bordering and not create a xenophobic regime or a xenophobic foreign policy. There's a very thin line that we need to establish, and that I think is the culprit, because if we do not establish that clearly, we fall within the previous narrative, which is we need to integrate, we need open borders, we need to accept everybody and pay for those that cannot pay, and just ruin our economic system, ruin our social system. So that's one of the real challenges here. At the same time, while we project ourselves outside of this region, economically, I think in Iran, for instance, in the case of Iran, and I've heard a few reports, and you might correct me, but I think Brazil exported over $2 billion worth of grain, yet it imported less than $100 million, less than $50 million from Iran. So any political change that or any political war that we decide to venture ourselves into, there will be a net loss for Brazilians. And I'll go back into 91. In 91, when George Bush set up the coalition to establish a blockade against Iraq, because Iraq was invaded Kuwait, Saddam, exactly. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then there was a national blockade. He called for a national coalition. Brazil had over $2 billion, that's in 1991 dollars, $2 billion 1991 dollars of trade with Iraq, positive trade. And because we did not have, I would assume, a clear vision for protecting our national sovereignty, at the same time our national interests abroad, we simply said, well, okay, we will not make $2 billion. That's what cost us economically $2 billion. So I think we are at a stage where United States and other powers that want our help will need to help us also in establishing clear national policies for foreign policy on immigration, and also how do we project ourselves and establish at least maintain our sovereign interests, considering that we might lose economically on these other fronts. So just would like to share this with you. I think these might be my ending remarks. I'm not sure about the time here, but I'll pass the word for you if you have any comments. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. They will tell us. Thank you. Wonderful questions. I have learned myself, I teach, I'm a professor, but I have learned to learn over the years that every assertion that is made to us as citizens, as decision makers, as opinion makers, need to be questioned. So you have an elite, academic elite. This is where it all starts. I know that there was a professor, a great speech, by how the classrooms, the universities, the high schools, are the place where our foreign policy is made or broken, are the place where our defense policy is made or broken. Because from the classroom, at least in America, in the United States, who graduates from the classroom? Those who are going to be writing the articles in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. Those who are going to be the newsrooms. I am very familiar with newsrooms. I go on TV every day almost in America. So my point here, my friends, is that not every projection that is projected in the media is something, oh, we're going to flow with it because it was just projected in the media. And I know how talking points are produced in the media. Question it. The real battle, before we go to the borders of Brazil, before we go to the immigration issue, before we go to what we're going to do with the Middle East, all these important themes, the real battle is a war of ideas. It happens here inside the head. So first, we need to challenge the premises. First, we need to challenge the veracity, the facts. So it's not just about fake news. There's a fake narrative that is imposed on us that would force us to think, and not just to think in terms of domestic issues, but in foreign policy as well. This is the preamble. Now, quickly, with regard to defense of borders, I don't want to challenge any military leader, neither here nor on the US, nor anywhere else. They have their own assessment. But we know, it's not a secret anymore, that technology is changing. The borders when the capitanias were moving in your own history were one thing. The borders when you had a national army, where every nation here had a national army over the past maybe 150 years, where you have to put a post in every single place, is another thing. And today we have something that is developing at the speed of an hour called the drones, called the technology, called the satellite. My friends, as long as these borders are not just in Brazil, but in the United States, and you know we have a problem with borders in the United States, but Russia, China, Pakistan, India, the next generation of defending the borders is not going to be putting military divisions on the border. It's all going to be there. Real space and cyberspace, and then you respond to the challenge when the challenge happens. So that takes care of the first talking point. Second talking point is about immigration and migration. We in the United States are living what I call the wall era. It's a song by Pink Floyd, but in fact we are living now the issue of we have to put a wall. That's what the president has promised. But the wall is not because it's a wall. It translates a vision that is, we don't want any radical force to organize any demographic move that would affect our homeland and our national security. That's the translation of what's the wall. The wall has gotten endorsement in the United States not because we like walls. I personally, I don't want any wall. I want people to respect the law. I don't want even forces on the borders if it's possible. If the education of people is sane in the classroom, I would not break the law. But we're not there yet. So what we have in North America, you have it in South America. There are waves of people who just cross borders. And I distinguish between two types. Those who are humanitarian, to just flee. I, was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and Lebanon had a lot of problems, and many people have fled from many places to other places. I know what it is. So you have one wave which is humanitarian, and you have another wave, another type, which is when radical, you could call them far left wing, you could call them neo-Stalinists, you could call them, we in the Middle East, we call them jihadists. It's the same. It's basically manipulate a demographic tragedy into a political weapon. That needs to be addressed. So if there is a crisis in an area, the response by a responsible government is to associate its national authorities and, if possible, international aid, but that's it, as a limitation, to address that problem at the border. There is no reason that waves and waves will come and change the demography and the economy and the identity of a country under the pretext and pretense that we have to open because of a humanitarian issue. If we want to be humanitarian, First of all, we'll help them at the border with everything we can. Real response is to change what's happening there inside that country, is to address the root causes, is to tackle evil that they are freeing. So my long-term answer is that why do people have to run that way through borders to another country? Fix matters in these countries. Now we have President Bolsonaro and his government here. Let's have many Bolsonaros across Latin America. And it's true for the whole world. And we need to have a strategic vision of the matter, not fall immediately as victims of a TV station making a speech or some professor making an academic statement. We are way beyond that. And you know why? Because of this. In the past, they would tell us anything in a controlled TV station, and we had to subscribe. Now, any statement made by Trump or Bolsonaro or anybody is discussed for 10,000 tweets to get legitimacy. Thank God we have this. So the issue of refugees need to be approached in a different strategy. The coordination between the responsible governments of Washington and Brasilia need to be tight on this matter. Actually, Brazil can help the United States at this point. Thirdly, foreign policy. I know that Brazil had over the past many decades interests around the world. So did the United States. The United States used to be depending on oil coming from the Gulf, on oil coming from the Arab world. In 1973, Europe and the United States were on their knees almost because of the OPEC tightening of oil import or export for the United States. We learned the lesson. So we opened drilling in America, and now we are the greatest exporter of oil and energy in the world. So what we need to do, what a foreign policy of a country that is changing needs to do, is look at the long term and see how we can be sufficient, how our alliances can help us. So you're not gonna get oil from, say, a country, Iran. Well, Libya is waiting for you, better quality oil. I'm just giving an example. There are many ways for a country to have a foreign policy that is not stuck. And in many cases, the reason for why we are stuck is because there are interests involved in that situation. Those who deal with the economic relationship will come to the country, Brazil or America, and say, oh, we only have to do business with this regime even if they kill all their people, or even if they send all the terrorism overseas, because we have interests, because our companies have interests. That is a challenge that we need to bypass. We need to help our economic interests to be smart, to be swift, to adapt to the situations. But the good news is way beyond that. And I'm concluding on the third point. We need to have a foreign policy across the hemisphere. So what's right for you is right for us as well. That would be a little bit predictive. Not live day to day. That's why I just gave the example of your foreign minister. I had the chance to speak with him in Washington and here, and he went on Fox, first foreign minister, since the election that went on Fox News and developed ideas. The issue here is that we can predict what is going to happen. So, with regard to Iran, for example, which is a matter that Brazil deals with, number one, trade with Iran as long as Iran wants to trade. Put sanctions if you want to be close to the United States as long as you want this relationship to happen. But at the end of the day, look at what's happening inside Iran. That's why you need experts to understand the region. I don't think this regime is going to last there for very, very long. And I'm not Iranian, I'm not part of the Iranian opposition. But when you have women rising, when you have a demonstration in 2009, the Green Revolution in Iran, 1.5 million demonstrators in the streets of Tehran, 60% of whom were under the age of 20. When you have now protests across Iran, this is a domestic affair to Iran, but do your analysis based on, is it going to last, or a new society that would look like us, that would trade with us, that would work with us, is going to be very soon our partner. I think a right foreign policy would be between 2 points. One point, doing the best we can to maintain our interests, but keep an eye on our long-range interests and let the best interests be in the best conditions of the country we are dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope we had another 6 hours and a little bit more water when we can have this a very long discussion. Muito obrigado a todos de terem escutado. Acho que esse assunto de relações exteriores está crescendo no Brasil. Mais brasileiros estão entendendo a interação dos agentes externos, como isso afeta também a nossa política interna e como ele mencionou aqui, muito claramente, which you mentioned, we need more Bolsonaros in the region. Nós precisamos mais Bolsonaros na região. Isso é fato, porque o atual presidente representa a população contra um sistema que não foi criado para representar a população, mas sim para governar e controlar a população. Então, é uma ruptura que nós estamos vivendo assim. O atual presidente Bolsonaro tem a missão de criar essa ruptura e eu também desejo, assim como ele, mais Bolsonaros na região para que liberte o povo dos sistemas que foram criados. Muito obrigado a todos.
Muito obrigado. Luís Felipe, Walid Phares. Pessoal, queria só citar aqui a presença do ministro do Meio Ambiente, Ricardo Salles. Por favor, se puder ficar de pé. Eu tenho acompanhado um pouquinho da relação que ele está tendo mundo afora para desfazer as fake news, principalmente sobre a Amazônia. E ele é uma figura tão importante que o Frederico Dávila colocou a sua esposa para sentar um banco do lado e o ministro sentar no meio dos dois. Então, Frederico, quando sair daqui, você vai contar com toda a benevolência e paciência da sua senhora para depois acertar as contas. Meus caros, 20 minutinhos, a gente dá um break e retorna às 2, tudo bem? Então até daqui a pouquinho. 20 minutinhos de intervalo.